Welcome to session 3 of our Regenerative Futures Retreat. We had 2 incredible sessions earlier, thanks to the blockchain visionaries. We are now going to go into session 3, which is Sustainable Solutions for a Resilient Florida, Sustainable Policy Framework, some case studies that we're going to look at, OCEANIX and the Reef Line right here in our backyard. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris Castro, who is an advisor to the Future of Cities, has been a collaborator with us for many years, is here based in Orlando as the Director of Sustainability for the City of Orlando, and is steering the agenda for Florida and for Orlando, doing incredible stuff with Mayor Buddy Dyer, and was with us recently at COP26 in Glasgow as we co-hosted an event that was really incredible on regenerative placemaking and solutions, and brought Florida to center stage in Glasgow. So I'm really, really happy to. He's a brilliant civil servant and visionary in his own world, and is bringing so much to the table and really bringing Florida into the spotlight, in the global spotlight of sustainability. So
Tony. Thank you. Pleasure to be here with you all. All right, so in our last session, as Tony mentioned, we're going to be discussing and exploring sustainability solutions, some progressive policies right here in Florida. And that's what I'm going to primarily be talking about, is more how I've been bringing my knowledge in this space into government, right? And almost bringing entrepreneurship into government. Really excited to have Jimena, as well as Mark and Daniel join us for this session and learn more about some of the case studies. Again, my name is Chris Castro. I'm a second-generation Cuban-American, originally born and raised in Miami, Florida. I've been extremely passionate about kind of this goal. All of my purpose focuses on how people and nature can thrive in harmony with peace with one another. That is kind of my mantra, and I heard earlier I'm not supposed to be sharing my mantra, but that's my mantra, and what keeps me going is trying to find that harmony, find that balance in society. I'm a community organizer. I've spent a lot of my time trying to build both on college campuses as well as in the communities through a nonprofit I started called Ideas for Us. That's now a global NGO of the UN, trying to advance the Sustainable Development Goals through local action projects, through local implementation of action projects. And, you know, some of what has come out of that are some really interesting social enterprises like fleet farming, where we're trying to think differently about hyper-local food production within our communities, turning homeowner lawns and vacant lots throughout our community into these edible oases. And most recently have been part of a team, speaking of the last session being about decentralization of currencies, have been part of a team that's brought in to try to think about banking, the traditional banking, in a new light. I've created what's called Climate First Bank, the first B Corp certified community bank in Florida. It's an FDIC insured brick and mortar depository institution with a focus on driving ESG and sustainable solutions through traditional banking. And so I'm very much interested in this hybridization of how do we look at centralized and decentralized and find this bridge that can allow us both to thrive. So one of the popular economists and futurists that I follow a lot is Jeremy Rifkin. Jeremy's well known for a number of incredible books that he's written, but one of them that stuck with me a lot is what's called the Third Industrial Revolution. And in this book, Jeremy talks about how a revolution or an industrial revolution really happens at the nexus when you have innovation in energy technologies, communication technologies, and transportation technologies when they come together and converge. So our first industrial revolution, as we all know, was really centered around coal as our primary energy source. It was centered around the telegraph for communications, and it was centered around the steam engine that had us now traveling. Secondly, we had the industrial revolution around the oil revolution, right? We had oil that we were extracting in 1959, Edwin Drake in Pennsylvania. We had the telephone, and we had the internal combustion engine. And the third industrial revolution, as you all probably are thinking, is this confluence of renewable energy, the internet, and the electrification of transportation, kind of coming to a convergence and really catapulting us into this next revolution. And so I've tried to take a lot of the principles throughout those teachings and incorporate them into Orlando. And I've been at the city of Orlando now for 8 years, serving as our mayor's senior advisor and director of sustainability and resilience. I thought it was going to be a 2-year consulting gig to help shape Orlando's clean energy strategy. And it evolved into much, much larger than that. And Greenworks Orlando is the brand that we've been working off of. Mayor Dyer launched this in 2007 with kind of this vision that, one, Orlando is one of the fastest growing communities in the country. We have about 1,000 to 1,500 people weekly moving to the Orlando metro. Every single week, has not stopped since COVID. We are the most visited destination in the Americas. 2019, as an example, 75 million visitors came to Orlando. We have a metro population of 3 million. We have a city limits of 300,000. It's about 200 plus people for every resident that are coming to visit our city every year. Think about the resource consumption of water and energy, the waste generation, and then everybody gets to get back onto a plane and head home. And we have to deal with, how do you sustain that type of an economy, right? Doesn't make sense. So Mayor Dyer has this epiphany. In order for Orlando to continue to be a dominant community that attracts talent and attracts, that we needed to kind of pivot to taking the concept of Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, and realizing that in the 21st century. And that's what we've done. You know, when cities are trying to drive this work forward, we often look at a lot of data to figure out where we focus our attention. And cities are doing greenhouse gas emissions inventories. We're calculating our carbon footprints. Believe it or not, 70% of global climate change emissions are coming from cities and urban settlements around the world. And when I was fascinated when we did Orlando's carbon footprint to learn that building energy use, energy that's used in our buildings, both on site with gas for heating and cooking and space heating, as well as the electricity consumed and the emissions factor associated, 72% of Orlando's operational carbon footprint. Followed obviously by transportation being a huge wedge, and waste and other fugitive emissions that followed. But for me, buildings, and I didn't realize that. At first I was thinking it was more transportation. But when you look at cities like Miami, when you look at cities like New York and San Fran and Austin and Denver, this is the mix of the challenge that we're facing. So my thought has been, how do we start to now use entrepreneurship to drive policy changes within our communities and move towards this philosophical future we're trying to get towards, right? And I wanted to highlight a couple of examples. Thank you. In buildings, right? Being the 80,000-pound gorilla, in Orlando, we have started to look at our building codes and require minimum levels of green building certifications. For any affordable housing project that's built in Orlando, you have to either be LEED, FG, the Florida Green Building, NGBS, the National Green Building Standard, or Green Globes. These are for well-known third-party certifications, but we're now requiring that it's not just about building affordable housing. It's really about how do we look at the full picture and the total cost of living. And when you start looking at energy performance and water performance, the burden that a lot of our low incomes face to pay utilities happens to be one of the biggest reasons people go into default or get evicted. So green building codes. We also were the first city to pass a mandatory building benchmarking and transparency law. Basically, we can't manage what we don't measure. And cities are now starting to look at, well, how do we require the fact that an existing building now scores itself from 1 to 100 and is able to then report that information to be made publicly transparent. So when you go to buy an apartment or a new home, you're now better understanding that total impact, right? Not just what it costs to rent, but what's the total cost of living. Believe it or not, the more expensive rent apartments are the cheaper to live and operate in. And most people don't know that. They're trying to shoot for the lowest rent and they're being burdened by high utilities. So how do you create a paradigm shift in that? And it's about making information transparent. The next evolution is what's called building performance standards, which now cities are starting to look at, requiring a minimum level of performance. So out of 1 to 100, if 50 is the national average, right now, our policy doesn't require a building to improve that score, but we're moving in that direction, which creates a cycle of local economic development and reducing emissions. Pivoting to energy. In Florida, we've been talking about some of the challenges faced by our Public Service Commission and how Florida regulates electricity. We don't allow for third-party sale. We were talking about this peer-to-peer peer energy that was talking about it. That's not legal in Florida. And right now we're battling the state. If you all are not paying attention, there's a very bad bill going through the state House and Senate that may really decimate rooftop solar in Florida. They're trying to reduce the net metering value, basically the value that you get putting energy onto the grid, where right now it's required to be a retail rate, the same value you buy from them. And they're trying to claim that that should be bought at a avoided cost rate or 1/4 of the current value. So we're trying to do a lot in Orlando to get around that and make solar more affordable through cooperatives. Actually, there's something called a solar co-op model, which is a group buying program. Residents get together who all are interested in learning and going solar, and through economies of scale, right, we're able to actually make solar more affordable, about 15% off of the total project just by joining cooperative. So we're starting to see really interesting moves there. On transportation, we just passed both a complete streets policy. Any new street that's being built in Orlando is now required to think about more than just the automobile. Who would have thought? It's bike ped, it's your single occupancy vehicles as well, starting to think about how that comes into a play. Food productions. Orlando started to look at how do we change the landscape code to encourage food production, and we're one of the first cities to enable front yard farming. And that led to this movement of people converting their lawns into edible landscapes. Backyard chickens are a very controversial thing in cities. We've enabled up to 6 hens in your backyard. No roosters, but up to 6 hens. Believe it or not, that was a very contentious issue. And urban apiary, trying to get people to really foster and grow, and foster honey and bees. And so one of the exciting programs that we've been launching is Grow a Lot, turning city vacant lots into edible landscapes and actually going into kind of an agreement with nonprofits to essentially turn those over at no cost, helping us to meet our needs. I know I got just a minute or so left. But in closing, I believe that there's a real opportunity for us to work with local governments in each one of our communities to take these best practices and many others and begin to scale. And in closing, a couple of principles that I've gathered in this experience. One, policymaking needs to center equity and sustainability, and we've been using the SDGs as kind of this Rosetta Stone for our community, a unifying framework for not just the city, but our regional planning council, our university, our county government, our utility, all kind of using the same type of framework to think about sustainability and eliminating poverty and inequalities and so on and so forth. Secondly, there's a culture of collaboration that's absolutely critical, and there are these peer networks that we're a part of. In the regional planning council level, we have a regional resilience collaborative, now 40 governments in Central Florida kind of working together to advance this type of work. We're seeing that in South Florida with the Southeast Regional Climate Compact. There's 5 of these regional compacts now across the state of Florida. More than California, believe it or not. We're starting to realize we don't have the state leadership, so locals need to come up and start leading. Nationally, we have what's called USDN, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, peer network of our cities. And then, it starts to scale internationally with groups like ICLEI. And so we need to make sure that we're not reinventing these wheels and we're working through these. Last 2, data-driven decisions. We're doing a lot around building automation, around digital twin. And I saw a lot of what Bajar showed earlier is kind of an idea of a digital twin. How do we actually take real-time data into those types of digital twins and help us to simulate solutions that we need to be advancing? What if every single downtown building was covered with solar skin? What does that do to the energy reduction, to the emissions reduction? So we're now building a 3D model of the city to plug in these types of data. And lastly, resilience by design. We're really thinking about redundancy and I'm glad to hear that everybody's kind of starting to think about that. We're working on resilience hubs, taking these neighborhood centers and low-income communities and adding components that will allow them to turn into really critical resource distribution centers during shocks like a big hurricane. And we went out to the community to ask, what are your challenges when you get hit by a hurricane? And of course, things like, well, I lose power, equitable resilience. I don't have enough money to have a generator. I lose internet connectivity. I need sand and ice and food. And so now these neighborhood centers are being converted into these hubs that will support populations in times of these issues. These are just, some examples of what I think we need to start to think about for policy. And so now I'd like to maybe turn it over to Jimena, right? Is that who's up next? Yeah. Thank you all for the opportunity to share some of this.
That was way too short for Chris. Chris is a brilliant thinker in the public policy space, and I think we should, after Daniel's talk, maybe we'll come back with a round of questioning. Sure. Our next contributor is Jimena Caminos, who is a dear friend, a sister, also has a house close to here and comes to Chosen often, and is also an advisor to Future of Cities and a strategic partner through the Reef Line, where she is the creative director and doing an incredible project that's an intervention of art and sustainability, and was the co-creator of the Faena Arts District, which is one of the best districts probably in the country, where art has used to be made as a placemaking tool to really create innovation and creativity and arts and culture. So Jimena, welcome to Chosen. You're streaming in, and we're excited to have you for a short moment. And please share with us a little bit about the Reef Line.
Okay, so back in the day, 20 years ago, more or less, a very bad sand replenishment project killed most of what was left of the reef, the coral reef that was offshore in front of Miami Beach. It was a fringe reef. And the Department of Environmental Protection in Florida declared that area as an area where artificial reefs could be deployed because they were needed for coastal resiliency and for live shore ecosystems and for marine life to thrive. So I decided to present what I thought was a beautiful and a little bit of a wild idea to the Knight Foundation, and propose the idea of actually creating a whole artificial reef parallel to the shore, but using art instead of having like horrible, concrete bolsters, making an underwater sculpture park that would somehow serve all those purposes that the city needed, but at the same time become an icon and a destination for ecotourism, and also a flag and an identity for Miami Beach as a beautifully, art mind and resilient city. Yeah, so we partnered with incredibly talented people from the arts, from science, from, architecture, engineering, and preservationists. So I called a dear friend, Shohei Shigematsu, who worked with us at Faena, and we made a great friendship, and asked Omar to design our master plan for the Reef Line. We also worked with Diego Lirman, who's an amazing professor in the University of Miami, Colin Ford from Coral Morphologic, a brilliant marine biologist that knows a lot about corals. Coral science is something, it's pretty new, it's only 20 years old. And different experts, because this project somehow sits in the intersection of art, science, and sustainability. So these are deployment sites. What we had to do is to re-permit the area. So we had to do a lot of surveys on the ocean floor to determine which were the areas that were going to be the best for the project to be successful. These are examples of different modules that OMA created that connect each separate reef. So the reef line is composed of more or less 20 giant sculptures, which serve as marine sanctuaries, and they somehow are like public housing for corals, for sponges, and for marine life in general. Between each of those modules, we created smaller scale modules to somehow protect those larger ones from tidal energy, and at the same time to create a connection between the larger modules. So if you're swimming underwater, there's a connector between each of the elements, and somehow an artistic vision and a curatorial line. So the first phase of the reef line is, it's called Concrete Coral. It's by an artist. His name is Leandro Ehrlich. A couple of years ago, we did a beautiful installation of a sandcar traffic jam on the beach in Miami. And it was temporary during our vessel. It was incredibly successful. People loved it. And we thought it was beautiful to give it an afterlife and to make the first artificial reef be an homage to that site-specific installation. So this is, a rendering of more or less what we think it could potentially look like in the future. Maybe a little too colorful. The corals here in offshore Miami Beach, they don't have all these, such vivid colors. It's 22 underwater sculptures that compose the perfect reef. This is the layout. And this is exactly the topology, the morphology that we need in order to achieve what the state and the city is asking for. So phase 2 OMA, they went a little bit outside the box. This is how they normally think. Their architects are excited about the lack of gravity or the lesser gravity that you have underwater. And they created this sort of homage of a staircase, because stairs have no purpose underwater, and a Pyrenean structure. This is just a fantasy because nothing this size would ever be permitted. So when you work in doing an artificial reef, you have to work with a design criteria that is permitted by the city, because imagine that we're in an area where hurricanes happen and we need maximum stability and security. So these are studies, shape studies that OMA did for topiaries. Most of these have been approved already. So this is a little bit of a conclusion, no? But this is the master plan. This is the length of the reef line. We're not starting down here at South Point. We're starting at north of 5th, because there is, every once in a while, there's good surf in that area. And the surfers were concerned that the reef line might alter their wave, which we know it won't, but we wanted to, anyway, it's so long. We made the concession of starting north of 4th just in case they were concerned. So we made that, we accommodated their worries, and are right now in a very interesting moment, which is we are testing in the hurricane simulator in We're testing the stability of the structures and looking at a potential first deployment of phase 1, which is the Leandro Ehrlich cars that you just saw, and the OMA smaller modules sometime in the summer of 2022. And well, this is press. This is just a rendering of this is what scientists estimate will be in 50 years, the sea level rise, what it will do to our shores if, we don't address the things that need to be addressed. So I guess that's about it. I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone wants to ask anything.
Does anybody have any quick questions for Jimena about the reef line, sustainability, intersection of art and culture? Okay, I think we're all good. We're so happy that you joined us, Jimena, and I know you have an event tonight, so.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to share more.
We're sad that you weren't able to be here in person, but.
Yeah, me too. Next time, Tony. Thank you for inviting me. Okay, bye.
Always, thank you for the work you're doing. We really appreciate it, and we'll connect you with the crew here. Have a great night.
Gracias.
Best to
Bye
Alan.
bye.
Bye-bye, Jimena. Ciao, ciao. So yeah, so you'll catch the reef line in action happening, another intervention that's going to help with tidal surges, hurricanes, things like that. And obviously she's dealing with a lot of regulatory challenges that Chris was referring to earlier, but that's where the cross-sector collaboration, public-private partnership is essential towards our regenerative prototyping that we're working on. Mark, I know that you said Daniel is going to start right at 6, so if you 6:10? Okay, perfect. So I don't think Mark at this point needs any introduction. So I'm going to bring Mark to the stage and allow him to, give his keynote on oceanics and one of the main reasons that we're here, and get into more detail on the possibility of floating cities in the world. And I'll give you this, Mike, and how that could be applicable to here in Florida.
Thank you, Tony, and so happy to be here. It's a lot warmer than for those who presented earlier. I love the circle. So we're getting tighter and tighter. So earlier today, Bjarke showed us the what. What are we building? What do floating cities look like? What are the systems that we're trying to integrate? How they scale? I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the question in the back of a lot of your minds to the why. Why are we building floating cities? Next. Yeah. So in terms of the programming and the scalability, this is the work that we did with BIG, with MIT, with a number of sustainability experts back in 2019, trying to figure out what would be the ideal scalable unit so that we could keep growing. So what I'll try, and Bjarke has gone through this very clearly as to what the individual pieces are, why we want to be closed loops, why this is sustainable, but I'll now address the why. Next, and one more. So climate migration. This is an actual picture of, this is not where I'm from, this is not from the Pacific, this is from the Caribbean. There are populations today that are being displaced by sea level rise. Where I'm from in French Polynesia, we're not moving people yet, but in my neighboring countries, our cousins in Kiribati, which are literally touching us, President Anote Tong a few years ago famously bought land in Fiji to start thinking of moving his people. So it's a real existential issue for us. So I guess that was my first approach when I was exposed to this. I was Minister of Tourism in Tahiti, and one of the things that ended up on my desk, this was 2007, this is before IPCC reports, this is before we really knew how bad it was going to get, but there were already the precursors, there were already signs. The old guys in the islands, the fishermen, were saying things are changing. So the data got better and better over the years. So in terms of policy, we had to decide at the government level, do you start talking to people about managed retreat? And I remember the president saying, I don't care what you call it, that's not going to work politically. It's very hard to start telling people that you're going to abandon your islands, that you're going to leave your grandparents who you buried on your land. We have a very close attachment to our land, so let's figure it out another way. So then you look at the engineering solutions and you very quickly run out of them. You can't build walls around coral atolls. Nobody wants to live on the inside of a 12, 14 foot retaining wall. It just doesn't make any sense. So that was off the table. And I have some background in mechanical engineering. I went to UT at Austin. I went, is there another engineering solution that we may be missing here? And that's where floating cities came onto my radar. And we're really, and I say this to our team often, to Matteo and everybody joining us, we are standing on the shoulders of giants who came before us. People like Bucky Fuller had 3 full designs for floating cities. He had Tokyo Bay in the 1960s. His patron died right before he got permitted. Then he took his designs, took them to the Bureau of Ships and said, hey, will this work at maybe in Chesapeake Bay? And the city council looked at it in Baltimore and they said, we love it, let's build it. And then the government changed. Nixon came in, so they scrapped the project. Then he went to Toronto. Toronto was redeveloping the waterfront, and Bucky drew up a huge pyramid and said, let's do a floating city on the waterfront of Toronto. So in his life, he didn't see floating cities, but all of his engineering worked out. And what's interesting is that the team at MIT, at the MIT Center for Ocean Engineering, that worked on all of his hydrodynamic calculations to prove that what he was proposing would work, trained a whole cadre of engineers that are still at the MIT Center for Ocean Engineering. So they were my hardest audience. I had to go present this idea to them, and they're all gray-haired. They've all worked on the ocean their entire careers. And I said, could this possibly work? And I said, if there's anybody here who thinks it won't work, maybe I'll go do something else, go back to Tahiti and do it. And they said, no, but there are certain constraints. You want to stay near shore, you want to stay in protected waters, sea stay 1 and 2, and most importantly, don't try to solve everything on the first one. So that was very, very critical not to try to fix every single system. So the other reason, aside from existential, is that the solution today for a lot of cities, coastal cities around the world, to deal with sea level rise is to reclaim and to just build onto the ocean, whether it's because of sea level rise or if it's just demographic pressure or it's just real estate. You have a lot of developers that say, hey, let's just dump a lot of sand into the bay. And there's not a coastal city in the world that hasn't done this. So this is a 400-year-old strategy. And maybe as a species, we need to learn to do a little bit better. So this destroys the marine ecosystem, obviously, where you dump it. But a lot of people don't realize you also destroy where you took the sand. So it's not just rubble, construction rubble, or just sand you just happen to have. You take it from rivers, you take it from oceans, and you destroy that marine ecosystem, then you add it to this. So this is a very, those of you who work in the city, you know what happens and where it comes from, but most people have no clue as to how big and how prevalent this is. So over the last 30 years, with satellite photography, they've been able to track this. It's not like there's a database of land reclamation. It's massive. It's 32,000 square kilometers over the last 30 years, 1,000 square kilometers a year on average. That's 1.5 times the surface of Singapore. It's 18 times Manhattan. And this is happening every year in every country. Not every country, I'm sorry. There are a few countries that have banned it, including China. So you can't even, China no longer does land reclamation. So what we foresee at OCEANIX is that this industry will start going down. There'll be less and less societal acceptance of this. Obviously, the environmentalists have been screaming about this for 20, 30 years. And we're proposing as OCEANIX that floating is not only faster, we're at cost parity already. So I'll talk about what we're doing in Korea, and we believe we're going to be at cost parity with land reclamation, but we're completely regenerative of the marine ecosystem. We don't destroy it. The fish are still there. They actually aggregate under the platform. So there's some very interesting work that's going to be done about how floating platforms will actually improve the marine ecosystem. Next. The other pressure that most people are not familiar with is that the number of people moving to coastal cities between now and 2060 is staggering. I think, Bjarke, on your slide, you talked about 6.5 billion people in cities. But to put that into context, 9 out of the 10 largest megacities, cities of more than 10 million, are coastal. There's a long explanation as to why we, as a species, like to be near the water. There's also extractive. Think about all of the England and what happened in Africa and Southeast Asia. Why was everything in ports? Well, that's how you ship things out of a country. So ports developed, and as a species, we keep moving towards coastal cities, and the rate at which we're doing it means that over the next 40 years, we need to double the built environment. That's 2.5 trillion square feet of extra built environment. This won't necessarily affect us here, but cities like Lagos, Nigeria may go to 60 to 80 million people, Dar es Salaam maybe 50 to 60 million people, and nobody knows how that's going to work from a material standpoint, water, energy, food, you name it. It's just completely unsustainable. So basically, coastal cities are at this front line of demographic pressure, and on the other side, you've got rising seas. It's literally an unstoppable force hitting an unmovable object. So what do you do now? And that's where floating cities, we believe, will be able to alleviate a lot of this pressure. So this was the roundtable where we presented not only with the UN, so that's the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed in red, that's Maimouna Mosharif, the Executive Director of UN Habitat. Bjarke is over here, I'm here. And when Bjarke saw my presentation, he said, shit, I got to take my slides out. So thank you. Now I see what happened 2 years later. Revenge. I know you didn't. So we presented there, and it was a very interesting day that we spent. We spent all day there. We had lunch. We finished up at our other partners at the Explorers Club. And incredible team of not just technologists. We had some futurists there, a lot of sustainability experts. And at the end of the day, everybody agreed. We've talked about this enough. Just build a prototype. Just go ahead, find the capital, and just build one. The UN didn't say, here's the capital. They said, go find the capital and build one, but we will support you. UN Habitat has been very, very supportive of our endeavors. Next slide. So it did lead to this. So it's still Maimuna who's leading UN Habitat. So she's based in Nairobi. We just signed this November 18th, so just a few months ago, 2.5 months ago, thanks to the work of our friends in Korea, including David, who just presented earlier on blockchain. So we're very lucky to have a very strong support group in Korea that said to the mayor of Busan, look, you've got these huge ambitions, you want to be the Expo 2030 site. This sort of technology is needed in Korea, so why not sign an agreement so OCEANIX will bring their capital, bring their engineers, bring Bjarke, so we can build it there. So in the meantime, between the first roundtable and this signature, we were able to find the capital. So we're venture capital backed. We're a VC backed American US company, US based company. We're backed by Prime Movers Lab, which is a strange combination of early stage deep tech. So it's not the easiest capital find, but when we did, they gave us the support we needed to propose to Busan. Next one. So now I'll dive a little deeper into how am I doing on time? Because I know, Daniel, I'm good? 8 more minutes. Oh, no way. I can do this in 8. This is a very interesting map. It's called a Spillhouse projection. He came up with it in, I think, 1972. And Antarctica in the middle, it shows that the ocean is one ocean. It's not 7, it's not 3, it's one ocean. It's contiguous. You could sail all around. You could do all the edges except for the Bering Sea where everything is touching. It's a very interesting way of representing 71% of the surface of the planet. Everybody knows that number. What a lot of people don't realize is it's a commons. Almost 2/3 of the surface of the planet are a commons. So that's where I'm really resonating with the work on the blockchain world. How do we as a species deal with this commons, especially if we're going to start building cities on it? So what we're thinking with our friends at UN Habitat is, if this is a commons, don't we need a code that would allow us to not mess things up? And if it's a singular code, construction code that respects the environment, that respects marine ecosystems, wouldn't that allow people to build floating cities faster if you knew that you were building it to a single code? So that's something that our partners in Korea, the central government of Korea, is helping us work on with UN Habitat. But expect to see in the next 2 to 3 years something that allows other companies to start thinking, okay, if we're going to be building these, let's do it to the highest standards. So that's a critical piece. Then, of course, you look at this need to build new cities, and if it is going to be in coastal areas, how many people do you move to the ocean between now and 2060? That's a big question. So next slide. So we'd like to propose, and we've been talking about this for a few years, is what does it look like to move 1 billion people onto the ocean? Now, whenever I talk about my work, a lot of people just worry that we're externalizing or we're doing the exact same crap that we did on land, and it's like, why are you doing this now on the ocean? Now it's urban sprawl on the ocean, and why would it be different? So I'll explain in several reasons why it's going to be very different. But the first part is we have a hard time with big numbers. It's very hard to imagine how big the ocean is. You know, you could say 71% of the surface of the Earth, 361 million square kilometers, but what does that mean? So next slide. So it takes 29,000 square miles, and that is at the density that our friends at BIG worked out. So it's about the density of Brooklyn, the city blocks, and we're leaving waterways in between, so it'll be like Venice, so you'll have all sorts of autonomous sailing yachts going in between, sailing catamarans rather. But it's only 29,000 square miles. So again, what does 29,000 square miles look like? Next, please, Roxy. Thank you. Anybody know what that is?
Lake Superior.
Lake Superior. So we're not moving 1 billion people to Lake Superior. But in order to try to imagine the scale of what we're talking about, it is a tiny, tiny surface area, tiny. I think in terms of the 361 million, it's 1/10 of 1%. I mean, it's at the margins. It's less than what the ocean is going to reclaim over the next 40 years by coming onto it. So it's a very, very small part of the ocean. That doesn't mean that we don't have to be aware and use best practices for those 0.01%, but it does give you an idea of scale, is that if we do move 1 billion people to the ocean, you will barely see it from space. It's a tiny spot. But why would we do it again? Well, what if building on the ocean, and this is what the big team is working on now, is trying to figure out what are the metrics, the ESG metrics, the embarked carbon, the embarked energy of these platforms. And we're trying to aim, we're quite aggressive on our goals. We're trying to hit 1/10 of the ecological footprint of a city like Paris or Barcelona or Athens. I'm not saying that land-based cities won't do better in the future, but today, for one resident in Paris, it takes 5.4 global hectares. That's the amount of land you need for the agriculture to service, for water systems, for everything. Each and every resident needs about 5.6 hectares of land. Whereas what we're aiming to do with OCEANIX is around 0.5. And that's Mateo's job. So Mateo, you've 0.5 global hectares. It is a real job to try to figure out how to balance what the needs in energy, in water, waste, without substantially changing our lifestyles. How do we hit that? So that's why I think 1 billion people on the ocean does make sense if we're doing it at 1/10 the pressure on land. And I think the last slide, so I'm on time for Dan. So we are at the Future of Cities retreat. So I do think a lot about the responsibility that we have. I think about Bucky Fuller and what he says about anything that you build you need to ensure that it does do it for 100% of the people. And it's not just either for just the rich people or just for climate migrants. What is it that is going to ensure that what we're doing scales? We're very aware that if we build something that works in Busan, whether we do it or someone else does it, we open the door to this expansion into the ocean. So I finish with this slide because I've been waiting for a few years for someone from the future to come back and tell me that what I'm doing is wrong. And so far, so good. So I've never had anybody from the future visit me and saying, look, you're about to really mess things up, so you may want to change jobs or do something else. All I've had over the last several years is incredible support from technologists, architects, engineers, and now Tony. So we're building the core components of what could be a real oceanic civilization. So it's a very exciting journey to be on, and I'm very happy to be sharing this with everyone here. So thank you.
Thank you, Marc.
Is Daniel? I'm introducing Daniel.
Great.
Is he on? Okay. Can I see Daniel? How are we doing?
Can you hear me?
Yes. So I need to introduce you, Daniel, first. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Not that you need to know
Unfortunately,
who you are, but
while you were talking, you were breaking up a little bit, so I hope this works out all right.
all right. Let me just introduce you quickly. And I had to put my glasses on so I could read my notes. I can never introduce you correctly. So Daniel is a friend and also an advisor to all the work we met a few years ago. And I'll read exactly what Daniel is working on. So he's working on catastrophic and existential risk, civilization and institutional decay, decay and collapse, as well as progress, collective action problems, social organization theories, and the relevant domains in philosophy and in science. So when we first met in New York, someone introduced us and said, hey, Marc, you're working on floating cities. You need to talk to Daniel. And I said, how come? And he says, well, he's been thinking about floating cities since he was a kid. So I'd like to, I remember the thesis that you had advanced. So I'd like to ask you, maybe for our friends here, you had said that the ocean could offer us a unique opportunity to prototype closed loop, full stack civilizations from scratch. Could you maybe dive in a little deeper on your thinking about this, Daniel? Thanks.
So yeah, the reason that I'm interested in OCEANIX, and I was really happy to meet Mark and see this project making progress, is when I was a kid, I grew up on the work of Buckminster Fuller. Probably many people here did get to be exposed to his work early. And as you know, he was proposing many reasons why cities at sea were important development. Also very inspired by Carl Sagan's suggestion when I was a kid that we needed to invest a lot more in social prototyping, fundamentally different social systems as experiments to see which ones worked proactively rather than just ideology that then we tried to deal with in warfare, where the enactment of the warfare to get there messed the whole thing up to begin with. And of course, if you're building a city at sea, you have the opportunity to do full stack infrastructure from scratch. And that's really novel. If you can do full stack infrastructure, if you could also be in sovereign territory, which being out deep at sea allows, you could do full stack civilization, meaning new law, new governance, new constitution, new economic systems. So you really do get a novel opportunity to do civilization prototyping. And that's kind of up in people's awareness again, currently, because of all the work on getting a Mars colony or space colonies of various types, seeming like it's actually being pursued as a realistic possibility. The thing I like about the Mars colony idea the most is not how do we diversify humans off of Earth in case an existential risk happens to Earth, because I think we're actually a ways from being able to do that well. I think the thing that is actually really cool about, especially places like SpaceX thinking about it seriously, is that they have to actually do the thought experiment of how do we do civilization design from scratch in a way that is totally closed loop. We can bring some atoms and bring some people and bring some biology there, but then we can't keep bringing things there or continue to generate waste. We can't generate waste simply because all the atoms that we brought there are pretty precious and we have to reclaim them because we don't have access to, new ones of all of the types easily. And so as we saw with how difficult Biosphere 2 was, you can't even afford to have a civilization where you have people in prisons breathing oxygen in a kind of closed biosphere type environment who are not contributing to the society. So you really have to think about how do we be proactive on our judicial system to decrease criminality, and how do we do that in a non-dystopic way, and how do we get our incentive systems that everyone is doing effective work in our social systems to where we're not having massive conflict, because it sucks to be in conflict in a bubble where you can't move away easily. And so one of the other major things, of course, is the way that we did our tooling here was based on the ability of very cheap resources, where for the most part, whether we're talking about oil or any kind of natural resource, we just cost them at the cost of extraction. What does it cost us to dig it out of the ground and then sell it at some margin? Not the cost for nature to produce a thing or to deal with the externalities environmentally or socially of the way we produced it. And if we actually had to deal with that and not externalize most of the costs, then almost everything we do would not be profitable. And we'd have to kind of redo everything about market theory very fundamentally. And so when there's a whole bunch of technologies that we use where we could have used another tech, it's just that tech, that decision to go down that branch of the tree as opposed to the other one was based on that one being cheaper and faster within the context of abundant resources and the ability to externalize cost. We're going to find that there are other branches of the tree that we want to go down regarding how we do technological infrastructure. And so if I'm bringing stuff to Mars, obviously I have to think about what tools do we bring that allow us to make all the other tools and under different catastrophic kind of scenarios, allow us to rebuild them well. The thing is, having to replicate microgravity is really hard. Like dealing with gamma rays is hard. The distance to get there is really hard. How to make a closed loop biological system is way harder than how to make a closed loop technological tech stack. And what I like about cities at sea is you get almost all of the benefits of that experiment, particularly where the experiment shows you how to do better civilization design relevant to remaking cities here. Because even if we get 1 billion people in cities, but we have 7, 8, 9 billion people at that time on land, it's really interesting, not just if it gets to be a better civilization itself, but if it gets to be a prototype for how to redo the rest of civilization here. And obviously, when we start to build anywhere, we're looking at the existing roadways and the existing sewage systems and all of the legacy infrastructure and the entrenched claims everybody has on what should happen with that place and how politics happens. it's interesting to think about in terms of social experiments. The way in which the United States was a massive step forward in kind of theory of democracy and liberal democracy coming out of feudal Europe was only able to happen because there was some new land. People could go in the founding of the United States as a new social experiment, how to be able to kind of create a new type of liberal democratic system that couldn't have been done in feudal Europe at the time because the existing systems were too entrenched, and some of the people had to leave and build something else. They were only able to do that because they were able to get other land. But as we all know, this land actually was not uninhabited new land. We had to genocide the people that were here. It was only considered new land because we had enough technological superiority to them that it was an easy thing to do. So explorer and innovator and conqueror always had to go together, because if you wanted to build a new thing, it was very hard to find a place that didn't already have claims on it. Especially, like, this is actually very interesting to think about in terms of civilization design, is that if you want to do something fundamentally very different than what's already been done, you really do have to go get some new territory to work with. And there really weren't places that we could go that other Homo sapiens had not already found. And even before that, other hominids, like increasingly the archaeology of the last few years has been showing that Homo sapiens were almost exclusively moving into areas that Neanderthal and other hominids had already populated, where it was tribal warfare, extincting the other hominids. That was how we got into a place. So that means that the violence to go enact genocide was necessary to set a place up, which automatically affected who the kinds of people are and what kinds of processes, that are founding things and what kinds of processes are setting things up. Coastal area has been one of the fundamentally scarce resources that humans have fought over, and we haven't been able to engineer that scarcity out of the system because there's just only the coastal area that there is. And one of the things that's very cool is, obviously, whenever you have some kind of fundamental scarcities, the price on those things goes high, and the competition and also the rivalry for those things goes high. The ability to engineer the fundamentally scarce things out of the system means that you can actually build a more fundamentally abundant economic system. So the ability to build more coast area is actually really, like, from a fundamental economics point of view, is a really incredible thing to do. The ability to build fundamentally more land that is really viable land, because it's all coastal land, and because of the unique properties of how this is able to be built, has some resilience characteristics that can be built into weather phenomena that are going to make normal coast areas much harder. The reason that is interesting, like I said, is both because it gives us the opportunity to do full stack civilization prototyping. It also gives us the ability to show that where there are fundamental scarcities, we can actually find engineering solutions around those.
So I think it'd be best if maybe somebody here has a question for Daniel. You and I will have plenty of time to talk about this, but is there anybody who has a question for Daniel?
Hi, Daniel. It's a pleasure to have you here. This is Tony Cho. We've crossed in the virtual world a few times, and we're honored to have you participating in this mini summit here at Chosen Retreat. And next time we hope to have you in person. So thanks for your contribution and all the work that you're doing in the world. What do you see as our most urgent threats to human civilization? Wow, we've got some wild animals all around us. Bats. We got a bunch of bats here. And why cities? Obviously, we're trying to prototype the future and mostly focused on land. And obviously, the full stack solution that you're talking about, going through governance, is really critical, because governance can be very wonky, and it's really hard to get policymakers to move quickly, and it's all politicized. So in your mind, what are the biggest hurdles and challenges to the evolution of our civilization right now, taking it beyond just floating cities as a solution? And what other solutions do you excite you at this moment, in addition to OCEANIX?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people are aware of, I would roughly say that all of our existential risks fit into three categories. There are the natural phenomena ones, and natural phenomena can be from the Earth or from outer space. So obviously a solar flare, coronal mass ejection, asteroid are fundamental ones. But then the other ones are human induced, and the human induced ones are both from the cumulative effects of industrial tech, which is all the environmental planetary boundary ones, and then from the faster results of exponential tech, nuclear and exponential tech. And so the cumulative effects of industrial tech is everything that, like the book Limits of Growth covers, where if you run a linear materials economy where you're extracting unrenewably from the earth on one side and turning it into waste and pollution on the other side faster than natural processes of turning the waste back to natural resource can go, you start to hit planetary boundaries both on the extraction side and on the pollution side on every particular material. So we can see that with biodiversity loss and overfishing of the oceans and soil erosion and climate change. And, you know, with climate change, we focus on the side of the CO2 that's produced by burning the hydrocarbons, but the other side is the diminishing return on hydrocarbon sourcing. Obviously, although the mountaintop removal mining for coal and oil drilling and oil spills and wars over oil and like whole geopolitical conflict over oil is on the oil acquisition side. But we also have diminishing returns. The reason that we're fracking and doing deep sea oil drilling and like that is we've got most of the good hydrocarbons. And so it takes more hydrocarbons to get all of the new hydrocarbons. So you have a diminishing return on energy on one side. You have a continued exponential need to grow the monetary system on the other side to just keep up with the embedded growth obligation of interest. And you have a one-for-one pegging between money and currency. So you have a whole collapse of the energy economic system that is impending, you know, because of that. And that's looking at the other side of the energy ecology supply chain from, you know, climate change. But we can see that along the lines of the problem with nitrogen fertilizers in terms of health issues and destruction of environment on one side. The other side is the nitrogen effluent causing dead zones in the ocean. So basically, open loop industrial tech, the cumulative effects of that are causing all of the environmental issues. One of the things that a closed loop civilization gets to do is to make sure that all of the new stuff is made from the old stuff. And so that all of the waste streams get turned into new product, and that the product is mostly coming from waste streams, that's all being cycled with renewable energy sources. So we know that closed loop renewable energy systems are fundamental. It's very hard to prototype that in participation with a 6-continent supply chain where you have open loops across the entire supply chain. So to be able to, now this is also why I get very interested in cities and future of cities is nation states are mostly fictions that were won in war, as were kingdoms and empires. But a city is actually a real thing based on physics, both, you know, natural physics and social physics, like a tribe was. A tribe was a natural self-organization of the number of humans that would participate well within a particular kind of social system. So were cities. And it's why cities had very similar types of development independently all around the world. And you would have some cities that would make it through the rise and fall of various empires they were embedded in, but the cities would continue to exist because the city was wherever the geographic proximity of people moving atoms around and interacting with each other created positive returns. And if people haven't read Jeffrey West's book Scale, that shows how you get superlinear productive capacity as a function of number of people in cities in a way that you don't in corporations or governments or any top-down structure. It's really fascinating. So the city is the next natural self-organizing system beyond a tribe. And when the sovereign individual says, you know, we have nation states that were based on groups of people interacting mostly through geography. And now, as you have groups of people mostly interacting not through geography, but through the internet, being able to move bits around in digital space, you'll have networks of affinity start to become more meaningful to governance. So you have this kind of network-based world rather than a geography-based world. It's not rather than, it's in addition to, because you still have to move atoms around in the physical world. And so you have the movement of atoms and the movement of energy and the movement of bits as all fundamentally different kinds of physics that all have to happen. And so you'll still have physical-based governance and physical proximity mattering. And the best scale for governance of that and the best scale for prototyping civilization design is cities. And of course you can retrofit existing cities, but you have all of the political challenges, economic challenges, demographical challenges, and interface with existing infrastructure. So the ability to go full stack with a city is also the minimum scale that you could possibly go completely full stack and be off of the 6-continent supply chain. So as we know, the 6-continent supply chain was an answer to how to not have World War II. I mean, to not have World War III after World War II. World War II was the end of the superpowers ever being allowed to fight again, because now we had such catastrophic tech in terms of existential risk. And it's important to get that World War II was the first time we ever had existential tech. Before that, we could not kill the whole world environmentally or through warfare. And so whenever we developed new, more powerful tech, there was always a race to see who could deploy it the fastest for dominance. Now, with the bomb was the first time we had tech that we actually had to ensure that no one ever used. And so it was a completely different process. There was also no time in the history of the world that major empires didn't war. And now we had to make sure that the major empires of the world post-World War II didn't war. And so you have this whole world system built with mutually assured destruction being a key part of it. This is the next part of key existential risk I'm going to give, is mutually assured destruction meant that nobody could fire their nukes. The Bretton Woods world was how the reason that we always had war was everybody wanted more stuff. And the main way to get it was to take each other's stuff. And so if we can create an exponential growth of the monetary system through radical globalization and industrialization and new monetary process, everybody could have more stuff without taking each other's stuff. And then the other thing is, with the 6-continent supply chain, if we're all so radically interconnected that bombing someone else would mess up your own supply chain, it was a economic deterrent. That system, that post-World War II system, has kept us in the relative superpower piece, even though we had proxy wars and economic and narrative wars that we've had for 75 years. But that whole system has basically ended in terms of its ability to keep working. And that was a world system built to prevent one type of tech causing an existential risk, which was the bomb, fundamentally. But the bomb was one type of catastrophe weapon held by two superpowers. And the bomb was a fairly easy to control catastrophe weapon because there's not that many places that have uranium, and it takes nation state capacity to enrich uranium and put it on an ICBM. But drone weapons that can take out infrastructure targets, and cyber weapons that can act across the world and take out infrastructure targets, and bioweapons that can be made with emerging tabletop CRISPR can be done by small non-state actors. And over the next few years, that becomes progressively easier. One of the downsides of exponential tech is it makes catastrophic tech exponentially more available. So you get the world of decentralized catastrophe weapons for everyone in the basement that don't use exotic material and don't have difficult hardware. So how the fuck do we make it through that? China's answer is we have to have ubiquitous surveillance so that we know what people are doing in their basement, which is actually a reasonable though dreadful answer. So you see there's a cleaving of the world into the direction of you can either have increasing catastrophes because of decentralized catastrophic tech, or to not have that, you have to have kind of draconian process, which is increasing dystopian top-down systems. And I would say for the most part, exponential tech makes those two the likely outcomes for the world, increased catastrophe or increased dystopia. We want to prototype something that is neither of those, but that means that you have to have the power to bind the catastrophic use of the exponential tech, both the intentional catastrophic use, which is warfare and terrorism, and the unintentional catastrophic use, which is Facebook just trying to make ad revenue and breaking democracy in the process, or anything where the externality of exponential power is exponential externality and the world just can't deal with even the unintended consequence, but then that thing getting stuck. So if we want a civilization that doesn't end in catastrophe with exponential power, it has to be able to steward exponential power wisely. And if it wants to do that in a non-dystopic way, it has to have systems of collective intelligence, which are fundamentally not like any of the governance or economic systems we've had so far. This would take longer, but we can show why combinations of voting systems and combinations of markets and the types of things we have still fail under these conditions. And this is one of the other reasons that I'm most interested in the ability for full stack prototyping, is the ability to develop fundamentally new governance systems. Because, Mark was saying some people are concerned about building on ocean is like, fuck, are we going to figure out how to exploit more stuff? And this is the part that I might not like about OCEANIX, but it's also like, there's a reason I do, is there's a book called The Maximum Power Principle, and it's sometimes referred to as the fourth law of thermodynamics. If there is exploitable energy, it will be used. There is pretty much no place where exploitable energy, where you would get a market return on exploiting it, will sit there and not get exploited. And so it's like the maximum amount of energy that can be extracted from a system will be. And that relates to this thing called the Jevons paradox in energy, which is every time we've ever had an increase in efficiency of energy production, we use more net energy. We don't use less and come into sustainability. Now the energy is cheaper, which is a cheaper input to new industries. So new markets open up and we use more net industry. So it's like, fuck, how does sustainability ever happen guided by a market when every increase in efficiency leads to more net extraction? Well, the only way to do it is you can't have the whole thing guided by a market, which is what rule of law is for. It's just we've only ever had rule of law at the level of countries. So how do you do global enactment? So then you have this multipolar trap that if anyone does the fucked up thing and they get so much more economic advantage out of doing it, then everyone has to race to do the fucked up thing or they lose. Or you have to try to enforce, but how do you enforce other countries that also have nukes and have part of your supply chain? And so this is like, if you want to say what catastrophic risk is the world going to fail from the most, it's that we can't solve multipolar traps, these collective action problems. So we can't, right now, anybody makes the fucked up AI weapon, everyone has to race to make the fucked up AI weapon faster. And the same with the bioweapons and the same with extractive technologies. And so the ability to be able to, and if you were like, well, why don't we just make an agreement that nobody does that at an international level, the UN can mediate it? Because we just don't believe that if China or Russia makes the agreement to not build that weapon, that they're actually not making it. We believe that they're secretly making it because that's what we'd be doing. And so we make the agreement, we violate the agreement, we lie to their spies, we spy on them. And so it's like to get over that is actually hard. And it's a governance process. It's how do we actually have more transparency and more governance to solve collective coordination and game theory issues? And so and ultimately our current civilizational toolkit can't solve it. It's not equipped to be able to solve it. So you have the cumulative industrial tech causing all the planetary boundaries. Then you have all the exponential tech that can cause way faster harm. And that also, even when it causes an increase in efficiency on industrial tech, that increase in efficiency just increases the total amount of extraction that can happen because of opening up new markets. I could give 100 examples of like specific catastrophic risks that are likely in the next decade, but they're all the results of these generator functions. And to be able to deal with that, you have to go closed loop at the level of infrastructure with a totally new energy economy, but most fundamentally you have to get new incentive and governance protocols in place that can solve those types of collective action problems. And I do think that it'll be a while before we don't have nation states because they won't give up their nukes easily. They won't give up their nukes to networked nations. But eventually what you'll have is governance at the level of city-states and then networks of city-states in conjunction with networks of affinity. And that is one of the other interesting things about the ability to make a new city from scratch and intentionally is that you can actually have a network of affinity populate a place, which was never really possible before unless the place was in the middle of nowhere. And the ability to have a place that is proximal, but also can be populated to run an experiment is really interesting. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Daniel, do we have time for another question?
Yeah, please.
Sure. I think my question's around, do these new civilizations, self-sovereign, do they, in your definition, require no trade or interaction with outside entities? I'm thinking about, do you see intentional ecological communities that are right now finding space in, quote unquote, fallow land, fall into that same portfolio of prototypes of a new civilization? Thinking about sort of this Wild Wild Country case where that commune ran into the sort of like failure case when they had a lot of other issues, but they ran into the boundary of interaction with the local nation state politics. So does that case sort of show that the ocean settlement civ design that OCEANIX is prototyping, could it also run into the failure case of once they interact with the cities that are already existing on the coast?
Yeah, I would say the case that is tethered to a city and the case that gets to be a sovereign constitution in open ocean are super different, and they're both interesting. Jonathan, I lost your video.
He turned off his video, but he's still there.
So the case that is near a city is also still going to be bound by the law of the city. It's also still going to be proximal enough to the culture of that city that it has to have a good interface with it, so that there's not excessive antipathy. And it also has to actually benefit the city, right? It has to say, like, what are we bringing to the city that is novel and beneficial? But you also get all the benefits of the proximity. And so if I'm going to try to build something from ground up where we can bring a number of people together, there's really no land that is proximal to cities that isn't already used. So this is kind of the only way to be able to be proximate to a major city and yet still have a large development. And so that's cool. But yes, it does have those interface issues. It's a different type of physical tech that can be out in areas of open ocean, but that type of physical tech is not too far off. But there, it does have the ability to do more deep experimentation with fundamentally different culture, fundamentally different economic system and legal system, and specifically things like property law and being able to do commons-based management, and have everything not based on the same type of property law. The ability to have a different judicial system, the ability to have different regulations regarding education, like those are really fundamental to civilization prototyping. Do we want it to not do trade? No, what you would want is, the first ones won't achieve this, but there is a benchmark of, let's say you make a civilization, and this is what most every intentional community figures out. They're like, oh, we're going to grow our own food and we're going to process our own municipal waste. We're going to be off grid, but everybody still needs laptops, and they're not making their own laptops, and they're not making their own biotech. And when they want to fly a plane, they're not making their own aerospace. So they still depend on a self-terminating civilization for their life. And none of the people would give those things up to be there. So it's not actually prototyping a viable civilization. If you want to prototype a viable civilization, it has to be able to have a viable tech stack that isn't depending upon methods of producing that tech that are self-terminating. So what would it take to be able to boot enough people and resources into a system where it could actually build its own tech stack? And then it can do trade and engagement with the rest of the world, but it fundamentally doesn't depend upon import. That'll be the point at which you can say this civilizational model isn't self-terminating or depending upon something that is currently self-terminating.
So no
Does that
Apple
answer your question,
iPhones.
Jonathan?
So no Apple iPhones and OCEANIX is what I'm hearing.
Like I said, there will be many steps in the transition of it, but as long as everybody in a place is using Apple iPhones, talking about how we're prototyping the future, it's like, well, kind of, you're also completely depending upon a 6-continent supply chain ecosystem that depends upon war and depends upon a mini military industrial complex and depends upon extractive oil and extractive mining and all those things. So you kind of haven't really prototyped a new civilization yet.
Thanks.
Thank you. Right, one more question.
My name is Amanda Cassett, and I guess I'm kind of an OG crypto gal is my, identity. And I've been a fan of your work for a while. And people have said we should meet, and so I'm psyched it's kind of happening in a way. And I guess my question is, I'm really fascinated by your concept, which I'm going to butcher, of the game A and the game B society. Game A being the one where we're engaged in the competitive Darwinian Hobbesian thing. And the game B is the one where we're able to be, collaborative and have abundance and work in a way that's fundamentally different. And I guess my curiosity about the floating, it seems like a game A construct actually will produce this. And that, it's funded by venture. There are economic reasons why it should exist. And so I guess I'm curious to hear your perspective on how and to what degree the move toward, experimenting with floating cities enables that game B transition, if you think it does, because I think that's very interesting.
Yeah. Floating cities are inevitable. Like, of course, we're going to try to expand oceanfront and expand land area and make cities and infrastructure that are less susceptible to violent weather and various things like that. And it's not inevitable, they'll happen in a way I'm interested in. Them as just extensions of extractive game A is the most likely thing. And how do we make more elite real estate for elite wealth holders, and just like be able to fit more people on the planet is probably the way that it goes. It's the same as like, there are applications of AI I really like, but I don't like most of the market applications, because most of the market applications solve some narrow problem and externalize the cost in a bunch of other areas. So, but it's not that. So is AI a game A or a game B technology? Well, it really depends upon what we're developing it for, how we're developing it. Like, it's a fairly broad category of tech. The same is true with crypto. I'm not that interested in most of the applications of crypto for types of currencies, but does better types of cryptography make certain important things around provenance and transparency and whatever possible? Totally. So what's interesting is the ability to be at the very beginning of an emerging industry and hopefully help direct it, right? Help steer it in a meaningful direction. That if there is enough cultural interest in it as a prototype of a new way of doing civilization, that the market forces that would otherwise pressure it to just maximize return aren't the only thing pressuring it, that there are better things pressuring it. And specifically that if you have to work with places like the UN to make law for how to build on the oceans, that you can actually have the right companies with the right values helping to prototype types of law where then other companies that are coming in will be bound in meaningful ways. So there's nothing fundamentally game A about cities at sea or game B about it. There's just a potential for being able to do full stack civilization design, which is needed to know that you've done a different civilization and gives you the opportunity to do it more potently.
Thank you, Daniel. You've been very generous with your time. I know it took some doing to get you on this call. You just moved, and we hope to see you in Florida soon.
I really wish I could have been there. It looks like a really fun scene, and Tony, I look forward to meeting in person. It is. Yeah.
Prototyping other technologies like Starlink here, because we're 40 minutes from Cape Canaveral, and so we're on the Space Coast. When we talk about space and ocean and land exploration for future proofing typing, it's a really interesting location, geographically speaking. So you're welcome to come here anytime. And now Marc is moving to Florida. He's living in Miami, so we're really looking to bring some of these ideas to Florida. And what's interesting is that, and Ganga Devi and some of the folks that I grew up with,
I just lost
back in the 70s, and a lot of that was psychedelic exploration, which we're not getting into in this retreat, but I think it's relevant to this conversation because what they were doing back then, utopia for themselves, and Chosen is actually an evolution of that and bringing in kind of future technologies with the ancient traditions of interfaith and the traditions that I grew up with at the ashram. So I think it's very relevant. And I think it's really important that we do prototype these, and they're not all going to succeed and they're not all going to fail. And there's going to be bits and pieces that we can extrapolate and co-design and empower, the 99% to co-design their best outcomes. So we're really grateful to you, Daniel, for your perspective, for your wisdom, for your passion, for your integrity and the work that you're doing. And we would love to have a follow-up conversation to see, get your deeper thoughts on future cities co-design collaboration. So thank you.
I look forward to that.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Yes, please.
One of the things I'm looking at, we talk about full stack.
People are online.
When we talk about full stack and we talk about design, I think one of the questions we got to go back to is the fundamental nature of reality, who we are as a species. Because I think understanding the true nature of consciousness, so I think every design and every theory will get outdated. Doesn't matter how exponential it is. If we don't understand that we are inseparable with everything, which understands that, I think there is a conversation on the nature of reality. and how we as a species have to be more kinder, more tender, and more compassionate. So I think as we look at designing, I think a very important aspect of it is that, if not, it'll be same shit, different day. You know, that's just my, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Conscious design. Thank you, Punacha Chopra, for being present and bringing it home to compassion. So I just want to thank each and every one of you for traveling here, for being part of this incredible mini summit that came together at the last minute, but was obviously a very important conversation to have. And I think that there is fertile ground here for co-design, co-creation. And Jimena and I in particular welcome all of you to stay connected and to continue doing this work, because the world's problems are not going to be solved or created in one day. But I think if every day were like today, I think we would accelerate this transformation much quicker than it's been happening.